I was halfway through flipping an egg when a twin-engine Cessna came screaming 30 feet above my roof, shattering my peaceful Sunday and nearly giving my chickens a heart attack. The yolk splashed on the stove as I ducked instinctively, my coffee launching off the table like it too was trying to flee the airstrike. I ran outside barefoot, squinting into the morning sun, only to see the plane making a slow, arrogant bank above my property, circling like a vulture with landing gear. I wasn't near any airports, helipads, or landing zones. I lived in the rural outskirts of a quiet valley, 30 acres of inherited land from my late grandfather, who always said, "This land is your castle, and your sky is your crown." And right now, someone was flying over my crown like they owned it. The next 2 days were a montage of ridiculous events. More planes, more buzzing overhead at random hours. It wasn't just me anymore. My neighbor's cows stampeded through a fence during a low pass, and Old Man Harlan's prized greenhouse shattered when a small aircraft kicked up debris from an unfinished dirt runway nearby. The kicker? No one seemed to know where this runway was coming from or who gave permission to build it. At the local farmers' market, the gossip boiled over like a pressure cooker with no valve. Some new HOA project, someone whispered while picking tomatoes. They said it'll increase property value, quick in-and-out flights for city folks. Others muttered about meetings they were never invited to, assessments they never voted on, and how a bunch of out-of-towners on the HOA board suddenly decided our land was their playground. That's when it clicked for me. I'd seen construction vehicles on the far south end of my property, near the old creek bed. I just assumed it was roadwork. But now? That looked a whole lot more like a runway being carved into the soil. I drove down the fence line that afternoon, stopping where my land touched the HOA's managed area, mostly a glorified cul-de-sac with overpriced landscaping and surveillance signs that blinked red for no reason. Sure enough, a bulldozer was leveling gravel. A banner hung from a temporary scaffold. "Welcome to Silver Pines Community Airstrip, grand opening soon." There were makeshift hangars being constructed and stakes marking runway length. The problem? Every single takeoff and landing trajectory crossed directly over my property. I stormed up to the nearest worker, who looked way too comfortable in khakis for a construction site. "Who approved this?" I asked. He blinked at me. "The HOA. Karen Weatherly. You'll have to talk to her." Karen Weatherly. The name alone made my stomach twist. She was the kind of HOA president who saw her position less like a duty and more like a throne. Ever since she'd moved in from California last year, she'd treated our valley like her personal improvement project, banning solar panels for being aesthetic pollution, fining residents for unapproved flags, and installing security cameras at the entrance for safety, which somehow all streamed to her personal iPad. I didn't need a flight plan to know this was her latest power trip. I found her a few hours later, sipping sparkling water on the patio of the HOA clubhouse like a discount Bond villain. I didn't bother with small talk. "Your planes are flying over my land." She didn't look up from her tablet. "The airstrip is part of a community enhancement plan. It's fully within our HOA's jurisdiction." "No, it's not," I snapped. "They're flying over my property." She finally looked at me, eyes squinting behind designer sunglasses. "You can't own the sky, sweetie." That's when I smiled for the first time in days. Because oh, yes I could. See, most folks don't realize this, but in some rural properties, especially ones granted under older land deeds, you're not just given land. You're given airspace rights. My grandfather's property came with airspace extending up to 500 feet, a fact I knew intimately because before retiring here, I worked as an FAA regulatory consultant. And thanks to an ecological preservation clause my grandfather filed decades ago, our land had also been designated as a low-altitude, no-fly corridor to protect local nesting falcons. I let her talk for another minute, rambling about elevating the community profile and attracting high-value buyers. When she finally ran out of buzzwords, I simply said, "Enjoy your airstrip while it lasts." That evening, I dusted off the old file cabinet in my attic and pulled out everything: deed copies, FAA forms, topographical maps, and my grandfather's correspondence with the local zoning board. Everything was still intact. Not only did I own the land, I owned the sky above it. And Karen's HOA planes were violating federal aviation law every time they crossed it. But I wasn't going to just slap them with paperwork. Oh no. I wanted Karen to feel what it was like to treat people's lives like her personal monopoly board. I submitted the first of many formal complaints to the FAA that night, attaching the necessary documents, property coordinates, and a simple message: unauthorized aircraft trespassing on federally protected airspace over private land. Ongoing daily. I knew it wouldn't take long. The FAA doesn't play around when it comes to violations like this, especially when it involves unregistered community airstrips built without permit. But that was only part of the plan. I started monitoring the skies using a set of DIY long-range motion cameras mounted to solar trackers on my barn. Every time a plane passed overhead, it triggered a capture and logged GPS data. I created a full digital map of every breach: dates, times, altitude. I even color-coded it for fun. By the end of the week, I had enough footage and data to make a FAA inspector weep with joy. I wasn't going to the authorities just yet, though. Not until I was sure Karen had dug herself all the way in. A week later, I attended the HOA's Investor Preview event by simply walking past the flimsy security checkpoint with a coffee and clipboard in hand. Karen was there, giving a speech to a group of men in aviator glasses and khaki slacks. She gestured toward the runway with pride, never noticing me filming the entire thing from the sideline. She even said the words, clear as day, and of course the flight path goes right over that open green space next door, completely unused land. Unused. That was my grandmother's favorite wildflower meadow. She had no idea the trap was already set. The sky wasn't hers to give, and the countdown to her crash landing had already begun. By the time Karen finished her investor pitch and clinked glasses with some polo-wearing out-of-town developer, I was already drafting the cease and desist notice. It was the kind of document that didn't scream, it simmered. Worded like a velvet slap, it clearly stated that all aircraft flying within the protected airspace above my property were in direct violation of both FAA regulations and private property rights as defined in Title 49 of the United States Code. I made sure it was registered, notarized, and overnight to both Karen and every board member of the HOA. I even had it printed on cream-colored linen paper, because I figured if you're going to end someone's runway dreams, you might as well do it with class. Karen's reaction was swift and so predictable it was almost boring. She didn't bother responding with a legal rebuttal or even acknowledging the document's legitimacy. No, she walked right up to my gate in full tennis whites, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, and handed me a shredded version of the letter folded into a paper airplane. She smiled like she was giving me a gift and said, "This is America. Planes fly. Get used to it." Then she flicked the little paper plane at me and walked off like she'd just mic-dropped in a courtroom. Now I've dealt with entitled executives, government agencies, and even a dictator's cousin during my FAA consulting days. But there's something uniquely unhinged about HOA power holders who think they're untouchable because they once managed to ban garden gnomes. Karen didn't realize that by dismissing my cease and desist, she'd crossed into an entirely different arena, one where I had more friends than she realized and far, far more experience. The next morning, I launched a full aerial survey using a drone setup I'd been refining for years as a hobby. With LiDAR capability and real-time telemetry, it recorded every flight path, altitude, and time stamp. I mapped out the entire week's worth of violations and paired the visuals with official property overlays. I even added some dramatic background music when compiling the footage, because if I was going to send this to the FAA and County Zoning Board, I wanted it to feel like the opening credits of a legal thriller. And just to sprinkle some spice on top, I submitted the footage to an independent aviation watchdog organization known for investigating unpermitted flight paths. They loved it. Within 4 days, Karen and the HOA received their first official communication from the FAA. It was labeled urgent and marked with a formal inspection notice. That same afternoon, a sleek black government SUV rolled into the HOA parking lot. Out stepped a woman in aviator shades, a navy blue blazer, and a clipboard that could probably double as a guillotine. I watched from my porch with popcorn in hand as she walked straight into their newly constructed airfield office. 15 minutes later, I saw her walking the property, snapping photos, talking into a Bluetooth earpiece, and nodding gravely at various parts of the runway. Karen must have thought she could charm her way out of it because she showed up to meet the inspector in heels, holding a fresh fruit platter and wearing a fake pearl necklace. That woman didn't crack a smile once. I watched as Karen's expression changed from smug to confused to slightly sweaty. The best part? The inspector walked off mid-sentence while Karen was still trying to explain how the skies belong to all of us. Apparently, what Karen hadn't known was that her precious airstrip was partially built on a designated wetland buffer zone. And when I say partially, I mean her entire taxiway ran along the edge of protected marshland, which was home to a semi-endangered frog species. I didn't even need to do anything. The FAA passed the information straight to the Environmental Protection Agency and the local conservation authority. Now, instead of preparing for her grand opening, Karen was suddenly fielding calls from 3 different agencies, each of whom had questions about permits, construction runoff, and soil testing. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat. No, she doubled down. Within days, she had planes flying in again, this time at even lower altitude. Her retaliation was obvious and petty. One morning, a Cessna skimmed so low over my barn it triggered the motion alarms on my chicken coop, causing feathers and chaos to erupt like a poultry-based tornado. That's when I decided to stop playing defense. I installed a series of high-frequency directional sound emitters at the corners of my property, angled precisely to affect aircraft radios and communication systems only when inside my airspace, completely legal, by the way, and cleared through the same FAA office that was already investigating her. To the pilots, it probably sounded like static or interference. To me, it was the sound of victory. Several flights had to redirect or abort landings after their signals dropped out mysteriously mid-approach. I wasn't endangering anyone, of course, just enforcing the very real boundary of my sky rights. Soon after, Karen tried a different tactic. She mailed me a notice, clearly created by her HOA's amateur legal team, accusing me of interfering with community transit, obstructing economic development, and, somehow, being combative to regional unity. I scanned it, laughed, then stapled it to the corkboard above my workbench under the label, Karen's Greatest Hits. She'd given up pretending I was just a stubborn neighbor. Now I was public enemy number 1. But Karen wasn't the only one underestimating me. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and tried to push through an internal motion to claim a portion of my land via a clause about shared community benefit. What they didn't realize was that I had already subdivided the edge of that property last year and registered it, on a technicality, as a wildlife conservation buffer. It was now a federal protected zone. Any attempts to alter or claim it, instant federal offense. The county clerk even called to chuckle when the HOA submitted the request. That same week, I got a visit from a local news reporter who'd heard whispers of a neighborhood war over airspace. She wanted to do a segment for the weekend bulletin. I politely declined an on-camera interview, but I handed her a copy of the flight logs and my FAA filings. When the story aired, it painted Karen as a delusional developer who tried to start a private airport without checking a single regulation. The HOA's phone line was jammed for days, flooded with angry calls from residents who had no idea what their fees were funding. By the end of the month, Karen's grand opening was postponed indefinitely. Inspections were pending, fines were stacking up, and every time a plane took off, there was a solid chance it was being logged, tracked, and reported. And just when Karen probably thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Because someone else had just entered the game. A county supervisor. And he wasn't thrilled about the illegal airstrip either. Karen had started a war in the sky. And I hadn't even launched my counterstrike yet. If Karen thought things were going to quiet down after the FAA started breathing down her neck, she was dead wrong. That woman didn't know the meaning of retreat. Instead of slowing things down or even pretending to comply, she pulled a maneuver so outrageous I had to reread the paperwork 3 times just to believe it. She filed a motion through the HOA to claim a 50-foot wide strip of my property under some twisted interpretation of community necessity. Her justification? That the neighborhood needed an easement for emergency air access. That strip just so happened to run along the exact path the planes were already illegally flying over. It was an open-air land grab disguised in bureaucratic nonsense. But while Karen was getting creative with her HOA bylaws, I had already moved 3 steps ahead. Months ago, I had quietly subdivided that exact strip and had it designated as a wildlife sanctuary under a local conservation grant. It was technically no longer part of my primary parcel. It now belonged to a trust governed by a separate conservation board, one that had no love for development of any kind. In other words, Karen had just tried to seize land from an environmental protection organization. That's like picking a fight with a nest of hornets and wondering why you got stung. To make things even juicier, I called a press conference. Not on camera, but in the form of a written statement that I handed to a very eager local journalist. It detailed the timeline of the HOA's actions, the airspace violations, the construction on wetlands, and now, their attempt to illegally annex protected land. The headline the next morning read, HOA declares war on frogs and private citizens. I couldn't have written it better myself. Karen, of course, didn't back down. No, she escalated. Within days, there was a sudden increase in flights, more frequent, more aggressive. She hired what looked like a group of ex-military pilots to fly small prop planes through my airspace, buzzing just low enough to rattle windows and set off motion detectors. One even dropped promotional leaflets midair advertising the Silver Pines Air Experience, scenic flights and elevated living. I collected them in a trash bag and mailed them straight to the FAA. I responded in kind. I launched a set of high-altitude weather balloons equipped with passive radar reflectors and cameras, perfectly legal, FAA cleared, and anchored to my property. They hung in the sky like floating sentinels, blinking slowly at passing aircraft. Every time a plane passed too close, I recorded it. Every time one veered into my balloon's detection range, it got logged. I even had a program that flagged repeat offenders and forwarded their data directly to the enforcement division. Karen had turned the skies into a battlefield. I just happened to be better armed. Then the HOA board lost their minds. They sent me a letter, on official letterhead, no less, stating that my weather balloons were a safety hazard and violated their visual integrity guidelines. They included a $500 fine for visual pollution. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my sandwich. I didn't live in their neighborhood. I wasn't under their jurisdiction. But just to be safe, I framed the letter and hung it in my workshop under the label Desperation, Exhibit A. Next, they tried to get technical. Karen's cronies started citing obscure county codes about aerial obstructions, clearly trying to build a case that my balloons, drones, and even my solar-powered tracking towers were illegal. The only problem was that I had already cross-referenced every possible local, state, and federal regulation before installing a single piece of equipment. I even had pre-approval from the county planning department and 2 environmental agencies. When the HOA presented their case to the county supervisor, he not only shut them down, he asked them a very pointed question. Why are you running an airstrip without a single public hearing or environmental review? They didn't have an answer. That meeting was a turning point. Word spread fast, and the HOA's own residents started turning against them. Apparently, a lot of people weren't thrilled to learn that their dues were being used to fund an illegal runway project that could get the entire neighborhood fined, sued, or worse. A small group of homeowners formed a dissenting coalition. They called themselves Grounded Pines. Their mission? Dismantle the airstrip, dissolve the current board, and restore sanity to the community. I liked them instantly. But Karen wasn't done. Her next stunt was personal. One night, I caught a pair of strange figures on my infrared cameras sneaking around the edge of my property. They didn't break in, but they got close. Too close. The next morning, one of my balloon tethers had been cut, and the equipment was gone. I reported it, of course, but there were no fingerprints, no plates on the vehicle. Still, I knew exactly who was behind it. And so did the sheriff's deputy who responded. He gave me a quiet nod and said, "You're not the first to have problems with her." That's when I realized Karen had been pushing people around long before this airstrip mess. But I had one final card to play, and it was a good one. 4 weeks, I'd been compiling everything: flight data, security footage, HOA communications, the forged fine notices, even Karen's grand opening video where she claimed my meadow was unused space. I bundled it all into a sleek, well-organized digital dossier and sent it to a contact of mine in the Department of Transportation's Aviation Compliance Division. He owed me a favor from years ago, and I figured this was a good time to cash it in. Less than a week later, Karen received her own surprise. A formal federal injunction arrived at the HOA office, followed by a full-blown investigation team, complete with drones, inspectors, and a very stern lawyer in a government-issued windbreaker. The airstrip was shut down pending review, construction was halted, and all flight activity ceased immediately. Karen, for once, had nothing to say. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because while she was busy scrambling to do damage control, the residents of Silver Pines were preparing something she didn't expect. They were preparing to vote her out. The day of the big launch event was supposed to be Karen's shining moment. She had tents set up, champagne chilling, and a string quartet on standby. HOA volunteers in matching polo shirts handed out branded hats and glossy pamphlets boasting phrases like "Fly into the future" and "Silver Pines, a community that soars." There were reporters, photographers, and even a local influencer who live-streamed the whole thing while panning across the gravel runway like it was a red carpet. Karen wore a white pantsuit and a grin that could slice concrete, waving to guests like she was the mayor of a city she built herself. I, on the other hand, sat in a lawn chair at the edge of my property, sipping iced tea and waiting. I didn't have to wait long. Just as Karen raised her glass to give her grand opening speech, a low thumping sound echoed in the distance. Heads turned. The sound grew louder, closer, rhythmic. Then the crowd's collective gasp hit like a wave as a black and white FAA helicopter came into view, descending slowly and deliberately, its rotors beating through the silence that followed Karen's now frozen smile. It landed not on the runway, but on the adjacent community lawn, flattening her decorative balloons and sending napkins swirling like confetti. Out stepped a federal compliance officer and 2 investigators, all business, holding clipboards and wearing expressions that said they didn't come for hors d'oeuvre. One of them held up a megaphone and calmly announced that the Silver Pines airstrip was officially shut down pending an investigation into unpermitted construction, multiple safety violations, and ongoing airspace trespass complaints. Karen, stunned and speechless for the first time in recorded history, could only blink behind her oversized sunglasses. The quartet stopped playing mid-note. Someone dropped a mimosa. The influencer turned the camera to her own shocked face and whispered, "Oh my God, this is going viral." And viral it went. Within hours, clips of the FAA's shutdown spread like wildfire. One video, captioned "Karen's Flight Club Gets Grounded," hit over 1 million views by sunset. Memes flooded social media. Karen's horrified face mid-speech became an instant classic, photoshopped onto everything from crashed UFOs to burning Zeppelins. News outlets picked up the story, digging deeper into the HOA's financial mismanagement, the illegal construction, and the complete absence of public input. But the real damage came from the footage I had compiled and anonymously submitted to a few online watchdog groups the week prior. They released a video essay titled, "How One HOA Tried to Build an Airport on Stolen Sky," complete with charts, drone footage, and a dramatic voiceover. It was both scathing and wildly entertaining. As the storm intensified, residents of Silver Pines started organizing. Dozens of homeowners, previously silent or intimidated, suddenly found their voices. A class action lawsuit was filed, spearheaded by a former HOA treasurer who had quit in protest months ago. The suit alleged misuse of HOA funds, fraudulent permits, and property value endangerment. Karen tried to claim ignorance, of course, insisting the board had handled everything. But email leaks quickly surfaced, internal memos where she referred to my property as dead space and talked about handling the crank next door. One email even instructed board members to bury the paperwork when they couldn't find the proper zoning forms. That one ended up on the evening news. At this point, Karen was being hit from every angle. The FAA froze all development at the Airstrip. The EPA launched its own investigation into the wetland interference. The county zoning board issued a formal censure. And yet, the HOA board kept insisting it was all just a misunderstanding. That is, until 3 more board members resigned within a week, each leaving with their own quiet statement and a very visible lack of support for Karen. Meanwhile, I was having one of the best weeks of my life. The FAA formally acknowledged my airspace rights, issuing a public notice that designated the area above my property as protected due to ecological conservation. They even sent me a plaque. I mounted it in my barn above the drone station, right next to my framed copy of the fake HOA fine letter. And just to add a cherry on top, I was approved for a grant to expand the wildlife corridor, effectively locking down any future attempt to develop near my land. But I wasn't done. I decided to turn the tide even further by opening my land, temporarily, to a local science magnet school. They brought out students to study migratory bird patterns, weather balloons, and conservation practices. One of the kids built a solar glider and launched it right over the old runway, with all the former investors watching from their cars, parked awkwardly along the street, wondering how their high-flying venture turned into a classroom experiment. Karen, of course, tried one last move. She showed up at a town hall meeting with a prepared statement about community vision and transformative progress. She used the word synergy twice. But the residents weren't having it. One by one, people stood up and demanded answers about the money, the secrecy, the constant noise, and the fact that their neighborhood had become a laughingstock on the internet. Karen fumbled, tried to redirect, and finally blamed outsiders for sabotaging her plans. That's when one old veteran named Walter stood up, cane in hand, and said, "Lady, the only outsider here is you." The room erupted. And that's when the petitions started flying. A special vote was called. The agenda: vote to remove Karen and the remaining board members, and begin the process of dissolving the HOA entirely. It passed with overwhelming support. The entire board was forced to step down. New leadership was appointed, a temporary committee made up of longtime residents, including Walter, who joked that the only thing he wanted from his airspace was peace and quiet. The airstrip was bulldozed 2 weeks later. Contractors hauled off the skeletons of hangars, the gravel was dug up, and the land was returned to its previous state, or as close as it could get. I offered to help with the restoration, even donating wildflower seeds and native grass starters. The land slowly came back to life. What once was a symbol of arrogance and entitlement became a meadow again, buzzing with bees instead of propellers. And Karen? She quietly listed her home, slashed the price, and moved out under the cover of night. Rumor has it she's trying to join another HOA downstate, but after the headlines and the memes, Most communities aren't exactly welcoming her with open arms. I stood at the edge of my field that evening, watching the wind dance through the tall grass. The skies were quiet again, peaceful. And above me, the space I owned was empty, mine once more. The silence that settled over Silver Pines after Karen's exodus felt like waking up after a bad storm, branches broken, signs bent, but the air finally still. With the airstrip dismantled, the HOA dissolved, and the neighborhood no longer under Karen's iron-fisted micromanagement, there was a strange mix of relief and disbelief among the residents. For many of them, it was the first time in years they felt like they actually lived in a neighborhood, not a miniature dictatorship with monthly fees and zero return. People started talking to each other again, waving from porches, organizing potlucks, even helping old Mr. Denton fix his porch swing without worrying if it violated some invisible regulation. The HOA's surveillance cameras were taken down, the code-enforced flower beds were allowed to grow naturally, and kids started playing outside again without fear of citations for unauthorized sidewalk chalk. Meanwhile, I found myself in the unexpected role of a community ally. People who once glared at me from HOA meetings now waved as I passed. Some brought me homemade bread or jars of jam, thanking me for standing my ground. I never sought recognition, but the change in tone was undeniable. Even the sheriff, who used to treat my property line with the caution of a bomb squad, dropped by for coffee one afternoon. He leaned on his cruiser and said, half joking, half grateful, "I don't know how you did it, but you managed to do what nobody else could, get that woman to move without calling the National Guard." The final cleanup phase brought its own quiet satisfaction. As the last remnants of the airstrip were cleared and the soil tilled back into its natural state, I installed a modest sign at the edge of the now reclaimed meadow. It was a sturdy wooden post with a solar-powered light above it and a plaque that read, "Skyhold Meadow or Protected Airspace and Wildlife Habitat." Underneath, in smaller letters, "No landings, no exceptions." It was simple, direct, and clear, exactly the way I liked things. Karen, for her part, attempted one final act of petty revenge. About a month after her departure, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a civil complaint, filed by her new attorney, alleging that my weather balloons had caused her emotional distress, chronic sleep disruption, and a fear of open skies. She wanted damages, a public apology, and an order preventing me from ever launching airborne equipment again. I didn't even have to call my lawyer. The judge threw the case out at preliminary hearing, stating flatly, "You cannot sue someone for using the sky they legally own, especially when you were trespassing in it." It was one of the rare times I wished courtrooms allowed popcorn. That would have been a satisfying enough ending, but fate had one more twist left to offer. A few weeks after Karen's final legal tantrum fizzled out, I received an email from a television producer. Apparently, the story had caught more attention than I thought. Between the viral FAA shutdown, the memes, and the absurdity of the entire saga, they wanted to feature the story in a documentary series about neighborhood feuds turned upside down. I agreed on one condition. They had to highlight the legal side and the environmental restoration, not just turn it into another slapstick HOA parody. To my surprise, they agreed. The episode aired 6 months later and was titled Grounded Ambitions: The Sky War of Silver Pines. It was actually pretty well done. They interviewed former residents, FAA reps, even Walter, who became the unexpected comedic relief by opening his segment with, "I told that lady this was a dumb idea, but she thought her glittery airstrip would impress the frogs." The documentary brought another wave of attention, and with it, an unexpected opportunity. A regional environmental nonprofit reached out, impressed by the transformation of my land and the way I defended both legal and ecological right. They offered to partner with me to expand the habitat corridor, turning the adjoining areas into a protected study site for local schools and researchers. I signed the papers a week later. What had once been a battleground now became a living classroom, a peaceful stretch of land where kids launched weather balloons, tagged butterflies, and learned about ecosystems and legal boundaries in one unforgettable place. It felt right, poetic even, that the land Karen tried to turn into a trophy for wealthy investors had become a sanctuary for learning and preservation. Her attempt to dominate the sky had only made people more aware of who really owned it, and what that ownership meant. Not just in terms of property lines and legal claims, but in stewardship, in respect, in understanding that sometimes the best use of power is knowing when not to use it at all. On the anniversary of the shutdown, I hosted a small gathering. Nothing fancy. Just some folding chairs, lemonade, and a simple telescope pointed skyward. The kids from the school arrived with their families, and we watched the stars appear as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Someone launched a kite shaped like a hawk, and it soared high above the meadow, drifting lazily in the warm breeze. One of the teachers leaned over and asked if I ever missed the quiet, the solitude I had before all of this began. I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. No, I said. I don't miss the quiet. I miss not knowing how loud injustice can be before it gets grounded. As the crowd thinned and the fireflies took over, I stood alone near the edge of my property, looking out at the sky that I had defended not with fences or fists, but with patience, law, and persistence. A plane passed overhead, far beyond my airspace, a faint light blinking against the night sky. I watched it disappear, then turned back toward my house. There, glowing softly in the distance, was the sign I had mounted near the old airstrip, updated one last time. It now read, "Welcome to my sky. Hope you enjoy the view." And for the first time in a long time, I knew, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that this fight, bizarre and absurd and high-flying as it was, had been worth every second.